Hello, this is Stabilizing the Economy, Section D, Tools of Monetary Policy. Our prioritized standard is Economic Standard 42. Objectively, we're going to compare and contrast how the tools of monetary policy can influence both unemployment and inflation. Now, the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve actually determines the percentage of a bank's total deposits that must be held on reserve as either cash in their vaults or as deposits in their district Federal Reserve Bank, which is better known as the reserve requirement. Now, banks may actually lend its deposits to individuals or potentially to businesses that it is not actually required to keep as reserves by the Fed. Now, when the Fed lowers the reserve requirement, it actually causes the money supply to increase since banks actually have more funds available to lend. So again, when we have reserve requirement being lowered, again, that means banks have more money to lend, so therefore they lend money out to people. And if people have more money because they just got a loan, then basically, hey, magic, we're probably going to see an increase of total production, which means an increase of job levels. Downside, of course, is you're probably going to notice some uptick in your inflation. And if the Fed instead decides to raise their reserve requirement, it actually causes the money supply to decrease since banks have less funds available to lend. So if you have increased their reserve requirement, it means banks are going to probably have to tell people no more than they tell them yes whenever they get a loan. So if you were counting on a loan, but now you're not getting a loan, that means our aggregate demand will probably actually start to decline. And by declining, hey, we got rid of some inflation. Awesome. Downside, you might notice some drop of jobs because of that too. Now, as we already kind of mentioned here, changes in the reserve requirement thus affect aggregate demand and influence the levels of both unemployment and inflation. As we mentioned previously, a decreased reserve requirement will result in decreased unemployment, but that increased inflation, and an increased reserve requirement will result in decreased inflation, but an increased unemployment. The Fed, I should point out, does not often make frequent or dramatic changes to their reserve requirements because such changes would actually create a lot of uncertainty in the banking system. Now, this might seem odd, but on occasion, a bank itself may not actually have enough reserves to meet its reserve requirement. And in those circumstances, it must itself get a loan from either the Federal Reserve or it might have to get it from another bank. Now, whether this loan will be from the Fed or possibly from another bank usually has to do with the discount rate. And the discount rate is the rate of interest that the Fed charges to a bank for a loan that is also determined by the Board of Governors. Now, generally speaking, the higher the interest rate, the more money that a bank has to repay. So higher interest rates means you have to pay back a lot more money. So generally, a bank will get a loan wherever it can get the lowest interest rate. So the Fed can actually stimulate or increase the money supply by lowering the discount rate. So in this instance, they have the lowest discount rate, which will cause lowered interest rates that will encourage people to get more loans. And therefore, with your aggregate demand increased, your unemployment rates will decline. You'll also notice a little uptick in your inflation by doing that also. So again, if they've lowered it and they have a low discount rate, that probably means people go to the Fed to get their loans now. Now, the Fed can also restrain or decrease the money supply by raising the discount rate, which will discourage banks from getting a loan from the Fed. So, like if you raise it, then they don't want to actually come to you to get the loan. So, for instance, in this one, if instead of the Fed offering a 2% discount rate, if they raise that to a 12% discount rate, that's probably going to change things quite a bit. This will cause less loans to be issued to individuals and businesses since excess loans are now given to banks. So again, we said you'll probably go where you get the cheapest rate. So if a bank needs a loan, they're not going to want to come here because 12% is really high. So they might instead say, oh, I'm going to go here instead. I'm going to get my loan here. So if this bank is giving a loan to another bank, then that means these people won't probably be getting as many loans as they might have normally got. Now, banks that do get loans from the Fed at a higher discount rate, what they will probably do is they will increase their own interest rates, thus discouraging other people from getting loans from them. Because banks still want to make a profit, so they will, if they have to pay 12% interest, they're going to make everyone that comes to them pay more interest so they can still get their money. So as aggregate demand decreased, based on having done that, inflation will decline. Also, unemployment rates will probably rise a little bit too. Now, the main tool of the Federal Reserve to affect the money supply is actually open market operations, or more simply, the buying and the selling of government securities. Now, the FOMC, which again is a part of the Federal Reserve, but they do only open market operations, nothing else, they decide to buy or sell government securities. And government securities, that means like treasury bonds, treasury notes, treasury bills, and these are in conjunction with the monetary policy that was already set by the Board of Governors. So the New York Federal Reserve Bank actually conducts these transactions through private securities dealers. So if you look to buy a government security, you don't know if you're actually buying it from the government through the FOMC, or if you're just buying it from just someone who happens to have one and they're just selling it. So since banks and large investors actually make most of these transactions, this tool actually successfully affects aggregate demand. So the Fed can stimulate the money supply by buying government securities. So again, if the Fed is buying these securities from banks and other large investors, this will physically pump new reserves into the economy. So basically, when they are buying, that means they are creating new money because, again, the Federal Reserve is the people that print the money. So when they're paying you, they're actually printing out new money to actually give to banks and large investors, which then trickles its way to everybody else in the economy. Now, the Fed can also restrain the money supply by instead selling government securities. So if the government is the one instead selling the government securities and not doing the purchasing of them, this physically takes reserves out of the economy. So if a bank or a large investor is buying from the Fed, well, once the FOMC gets that money is basically destroyed. It's no longer in the economy. It's not out there anymore. So banks now with reduced funds, or large investors with reduced funds, can actually provide fewer loans to individuals and businesses since now their funds are tied up in investments. With aggregate demand decreased based on having done this, you'll notice inflation will decrease, but your unemployment rates might actually rise a little bit. All right, so hopefully an easier way to try to remember when you're talking about the Federal Open Market Committee and what they do. When the Federal Open Market Committee, when the FOMC buys federal securities, the money supply gets big. So they buy big. So big money supply means big inflation rate. It also means more jobs too. When the FOMC sells federal securities, the money supply gets small. So sell small, when the FOMC sells small means the money supply gets small, which means you'll have less inflation. Consequence, unemployment probably does go up a little bit too. All right, that concludes Stabilizing the Economy, Section D, Tools of Monetary Policy. Our prioritized standard again was Economic Standard 42. Objectively, now you can compare and contrast how the tools of monetary policy can influence both unemployment and inflation.